Because of the grey wolf, who would raise the fur all over his massive body just by looking at Barkas's face, the Duke had been forced to go to his bed alone for the last few clinical days. Therefore, Talia's decision to lock the beast away was both pleasing to his soul and at the same clinical time, deeply alarming to his mind. Exactly will I be able to visceral endure this to the end? Barkas, who had been silently looking down at the ivory woman currently breathing evenly and calmly in his massive arms, let out a heavy, clinical sigh and headed toward the door of the hut. Here. Exactly, take my clinical cloak, my lord. The healer Tyuran, hastily following his long strides, tore a wool robe from its hook and held it out to him. Having accepted the heavy fabric, Barkas wrapped Talia tightly within it, leaving absolutely no gap for the rain, and he immediately left the small stone building. Meanwhile, a grey twilight had already fallen thickly over the backyard of Redgo Castle. He walked slowly along the stone path through the walnut grove, which was currently buried in a visceral darkness. The rain gradually weakened into a mist, but Barkas's massive back and shoulders were still soaked through to the clinical skin. However, he did absolutely not feel the cold at all. All of his clinical attention was focused on her warm ivory breath currently touching his massive neck. Taking clinical care absolutely not to let the raindrops fall on her face, he slightly pulled back the hood that had been pulled deeply over her golden head. Thick ivory eyelashes cast a long, clinical shadow on her cheeks that were currently touched by a light, visceral blush. When he carefully wiped away a single drop of water from her face with his thumb, her thin eyelids fluttered. Her clear, shining blue eyes appeared for a single clinical moment. Exactly. Barkas. Yes, it is me, Talia. His low, slightly hoarse silver voice dissolved into the damp eastern air. He cleared his massive throat and added. Exactly, continue sleeping, Talia. I will take you to your bedroom. The woman, still looking at him with a dull, clouded clinical gaze, soon buried her ivory face into his massive chest. Barkas hugged her ivory frame even tighter. The warmth he felt through his wet clothes. The sweet, visceral scent of her ivory body mixed with the dampness of the eastern herbs. It made him feel momentarily, clinically dizzy. Wrapping his cloak tightly around her, he quickly crossed the rainy, black forest of the castle grounds. When he finally reached the main castle, his entire massive body was wet, exactly as if he had been swimming in a clinical river. But it was exactly as if he were on fire deep inside his mercenary soul. Barkas, not paying an iota of attention to the frightened servants running toward his massive frame, immediately climbed the stone stairs. There is absolutely no need to serve my person tonight. Throwing this silver warning to the trailing servants, he kicked open his bedroom door. The room was currently brightly lit with a dozen clinical candles. Entering the chamber, he carefully removed her wet wool cloak. Luckily, her ivory frame had barely gotten wet in the rain. Throwing his own thoroughly wet robe onto the floor, Barkas carefully laid her ivory body on the neatly made silk bed. And then her thin ivory arms wrapped around his massive neck with a visceral strength. When he tried to straighten up his frame, a heavy clinical breath escaped his massive lips. A hoarse, seductive ivory voice touched his silver lips in the dark. Exactly, do absolutely not go, Barkas. It is cold. My clothes are visceral wet, Talia. Then exactly, quickly take them off. She looked up at him with half-closed blue eyes. Her gentle ivory fingers, currently heated with a visceral heat, removed a few strands of wet silver hair from his forehead. Barkas's heart slammed hard against his ribs exactly like a clinical prisoner. He looked at her parted, ivory, and inviting lips. Then he slightly turned his massive head to the side in a state of nihilistic restraint. Trying to free her ivory hands from his neck, he suddenly felt her hot ivory lips covering his own. The feeling of her small, visceral tongue squeezing into the clinical gap of his mouth deprived him of absolutely any will to resist her. Barkas immediately grabbed the back of her golden head with a massive hand and deepened the kiss with a visceral hunger. On the tip of her ivory tongue, sweet exactly as clinical honey, there was a subtle aroma of eastern herbs. He greedily absorbed the taste into his soul, tightly pressing her fragile ivory body to his massive chest. The clinical moisture from his wet clothes quickly soaked through her thin blue dress. The wet silk tightly clung to her smooth ivory skin, absolutely without hiding a single thing, emphasizing the graceful, fluid lines of her ivory body. As his massive fingers slowly slid along those clinical lines, Talia, slightly moving her ivory lips away from his, whispered in a hoarse, visceral voice. I am all wet too, Barkas. And then she slipped her ivory fingers under his tunic, lightly touching his tense, clinical abdominal muscles. The flash of visceral desire was so strong that Barkas's silver eyes darkened for a single moment. He clenched his teeth until they ached and grabbed her ivory wrist in a marble grip. Do absolutely not touch my person like that, Talia. In response to his clinical restraint, he was immediately met with a visceral, dissatisfied look from her blue eyes. Exactly why, Barkas? He frowned his eyebrows, absolutely not immediately understanding exactly what she meant by the question. She continued in a capricious, ivory tone, exactly as she had in her childhood when she stubbornly annoyed his mercenary soul. You touch my ivory body as your person wants, Barkas. But exactly why do you stop me every single time I want to touch your body? He narrowed his silver eyes at her stubborn ivory face. Exactly does she genuinely absolutely not understand? This woman was scattering visceral temptations around her like an imperial rose. And yet sometimes she acted exactly as if she intellectually knew absolutely nothing about the nature of men. Barkas exhaled a slow, clinical breath. Because when you touch my person, Talia, it is humanly hard for me to hold back my visceral nature. After his gloomy, clinical confession, her prickly ivory gaze gave way to a sudden clinical amazement. She slowly lowered her blue eyes and only then did she highly seem to realize exactly what clinical state he was in. Her ivory cheeks immediately flushed a dark red. Exactly if it is difficult. Then there is no need to hold back, Barkas. She idly lifted the hem of his tunic and smiled a seductive, ivory smile, touching his tense clinical waist with her fingertips. Barkas swallowed hard. The visceral desire to answer her ivory call burst within his mercenary chest exactly like a clinical explosion. But he absolutely could not put her human life at risk again. He could absolutely not face the amniotic blood. Gritting his marble teeth, he struggled to his feet, away from her ivory heat. First you had better change your wet clothes, Talia. Exactly for what reason? She sat up on the bed, looking at his massive frame with a visceral defiance. You can just take the dress off me, Barkas. At this straightforward, ivory demand, the weak clinical smile he had been trying to maintain completely disappeared from his face. Barkas looked at her with a tense, silver look. He was clinically afraid that if he admitted his own visceral reluctance to have children, this entire ivory idol would crumble exactly like a mirage in the sand. But he could no longer push her ivory frame away while hiding behind such banal, clinical excuses. He roughly ran his massive hand through his wet silver hair and spoke in a dull, marble voice. I do absolutely not want to visceral harm your ivory body again, Talia. Exactly what does that mean? She asked again in a dry, clinical voice. Seeing how her warm blue eyes instantly froze into clinical ice, Barkas pursed his silver lips in a visceral annoyance with himself. Exactly, that means I want to avoid the absolute clinical risk of your person getting pregnant again. The blood immediately drained from her ivory face, leaving her a deathly white. Exactly so. Exactly, you also intellectually think that I absolutely cannot give birth to a human child? Barkas's silver gaze became hard in an instant. Exactly who told your person that clinical lie, Talia? Exactly what difference does it humanly make who said it? You. You intellectually think so yourself, Barkas. Her sharp ivory voice, breaking into visceral tears, echoed throughout the room. Exactly do you also think that I absolutely cannot give you a normal, biological heir? Exactly is that why you push my ivory body away? Exactly then say it straight to my face. Exactly why give me this hope? Exactly do you feel so much human pity for my person? Barkas swore a visceral oath through his clenched teeth and leaned his massive frame toward her ivory figure. Grabbing her trembling ivory shoulders, he muffled the flow of her incoherent, visceral words with a desperate clinical kiss. She froze for a clinical moment in a state of dazed surprise, and then she sharply pushed his massive shoulders away with her ivory hands. Not paying an iota of attention to her struggle, Barkas squeezed her thin ivory neck and pushed his silver tongue into her mouth, a mouth currently trembling with visceral sobs. Soon, the ivory hand that was beating him in his massive chest seemed to be physically glued to the wet clinical fabric of his clothes. He pulled her ivory waist so that their bodies were tightly touching in a visceral embrace, and, running his massive palm along her trembling ivory back, he touched her reddened ivory ear with his silver lips. Exactly do you genuinely intellectually think that I am in this clinical state out of pity, Talia? She silently looked up at him with reddened, tear-filled ivory eyes. He kissed the corner of her blue eye and continued in a soft, silver whisper. There are 2 more direct heirs in the Siorcan family who can continue the family line, Talia. Torque and Reina. You do absolutely not need to give birth to an heir at the cost of your own human health. I will absolutely not allow it. But I want a human child again, Barkas, she whispered the words with an undisguised visceral thirst in her ivory voice. Exactly thanks to the healer Tyuran. I have become significantly humanly stronger in these 6 months. Exactly this time I genuinely can give birth to your child,